Okay, I think we're live. Vader was meowing a lot right when I started the stream, of course. That's how it goes. And Floki is upstairs, hopefully sleeping. And that will give us a little more peace and quiet for the stream. Let me just post in Discord. Okay, cool. All right. Heroic Harley Quinn. Nice name. Hello. Victorian Studio, good morning. Good morning, good morning. It is afternoon, early afternoon here. It might actually still be sunny or daylight when I end stream, which will be amazing. It seems like for so long, every time I end stream, it's dark. But I just recently started to notice that it's getting lighter when I wake up, and I think it's still dark when Wolfie gets home at night, though. We might be pushing it there. Excuse me. Hi, Lady T. Hi, Anna. Hi, Tony. Winter's Rain, you got your postcard? I love how fast they get to you. It makes me so happy. I sent yours and Becky's, which is going to China. So, like, yours gets there today. Hers will get there in, like, 2 or 3 weeks. I don't even know. But I'll send the rest of them tomorrow because I had to get more stamps. Hello, Lynn. Hi, Perry. Hi, Spectra. Can't stay long, no worries. So if anyone has to go, or if you're watching this in the future, obviously this will be a replay on my YouTube channel. So you could always come back and watch it, or like reference things in the future. And oops, oh, I forgot I could zoom out a little. Cool. But the way things are kind of gonna work. Sorry, let me just clean these off. I'm just gonna go through. I have a whole agenda, you guys, with words. I'm gonna go through everything. I wrote down everything I could think of for gouache, trying to think about it from a beginner's perspective. And at the end, if you have any questions or have any specific demo requests, save them for the end, and we'll do that at the end. But you can see the agenda below me. That's kind of how we're going to go through everything. I try to make it as like straightforward as possible. And hopefully this video can then be a reference for whoever in the future when it's needed. And I can also point people towards it when they ask questions that are for like someone who's just starting out. Like a lot of people come into the streams or comment on my videos like, I just got gouache, how do I get started? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I wish I could just tell you everything in a comment, but it takes too long. Hello, Iwenka and Foster. Foster. Oh, hi, hello. It's always tricky when people have different names on YouTube versus like Twitch or elsewhere. Let's make chat just a little bigger. Okay. Please ignore the background. It is an absolute disaster in here because this is the main room that we let Floki, our new kitten, run around. Between him and Vader, there are just like toys and cardboard boxes and crumpled up pieces of paper everywhere. Yeah. You would think if someone came in, they'd be like, oh, you have a toddler? No, just 2 cats. Hello, Jessica. Hello, Wood Spirit. Welcome everybody who is new and who isn't new. I think we'll get started though, and I'm sure people will kind of filter in here and there, But yeah, I don't want the recording of this to be too long, or I just want to like get straight to the point. So let's think about this. Imagine, or maybe you don't have to imagine because this is your situation right now. You just got your first set of gouache, or someone is about to gift you a set of gouache for your birthday or something, or you've been interested in gouache for years and you've always wanted to try it and you're finally ready to make the jump, but you kind of just don't know where to start. And I am going to do my best to give you that information as straightforward as I can. And this video will stay on my channel. You can replay it in the future as many times as you want. And I just hope it'll be a good resource for anybody out there who is just getting started. And as I said earlier, just save your questions for the end and your demo requests for the end, because I might actually cover what you want to ask or what you want to see throughout this session. And if there's any remaining questions or anything, we can just go through that at the end. So obviously the first thing would be paint. Like, you need paint. And it's funny when I think about what's the most important thing. Well, obviously it's the paint. Everything else is secondary to that. So I get a lot of questions about this, but I'll just quickly go through materials that you need to get started. Paint being the first one. And so basically paint, brushes, and paper are all you really need, but there's more that you could get, or more that you can go into it much deeper if you want to. And to start off, I'm going to show you this, what I'm holding. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These 5 colors are what I use for like at least half of my paintings that I ever do with gouache. These are primary colors plus black and white. But we'll get into colors in a little while. But if you are just starting out and you're just like, I don't know, I just want to try it, all you really need are the primary colors and white. It's also helpful if you can get black as well. And hopefully with 5 colors, like, it doesn't break the bank. So that's the basics. That's your gold right there. Brushes are another thing that I think interests everybody, and it's also one of those really personal things. Also, hi Ellie, hi Nevermore, hi Em. Your background is great. Hey Catmids. So brushes are personal. This is what I prefer. I use a lot of flat brushes with my gouache, and the main reason for that is because it's easier to control the amount of water I have in my brush stroke, in my mix. And the more you use gouache, the more you use specific brushes, you'll get familiar with your own brushes, and you'll get familiar with your water amounts and like the water control that you need. So I'm not saying you can't use like round brushes like you would with watercolor. A lot of people do that, but I think for a beginner, flat brushes make it just a little bit easier to control the amount of water. And if you're struggling with that, it might be worth trying. I personally also love the big, like, chunky shapes I can achieve with gouache, with flat brushes, I mean. I love that style, I guess you'd say. So it's a personal thing. So I have a ton of different brushes, and they're all different brands. I'm not loyal to one specific brand, but I buy mostly cheap brushes and they get lost, and then I find them later, or sometimes like my cheapest brushes will be the ones that last the longest. You just never know. But more than anything, more than brand, more than other people recommending things to you, I highly recommend that you go to an art store and actually feel the brushes. And the more you paint, the more you might think, oh, I wish I had a brush that was a little bit stiffer or a little bit softer. And from there, you can start building up your collection, because it is so personal. And yeah, I know this is, just take everything I say with a grain of salt, like knowing that it's my personal opinion. Hi Xenium, hi Arlene. Painting the grass, I haven't painted anything yet, but we might paint grass. So another thing that you'll need obviously is paper, and I tend to paint on hot press paper because with gouache, a lot of times I want to get a nice like crisp line, and sometimes, not always, the texture of cold press paper will make it a little bit trickier, or it'll the texture of the cold press paper will show through a little bit more. I also love that for some things, so don't get me wrong, I also use cold press paper a lot, but in general I just tend to paint on hot press more with gouache because it's a much smoother surface. You can spread the paint more smoothly, more easily, and I think it's a little bit more friendly for beginners. Maybe unless you're coming from a watercolor background and you're already really familiar with cold press paper, then you probably will love cold press paper for gouache. So this is actually non-cotton. It's not the fancy 100% cotton paper. It's Dollar Rowney, I think that's how you say it. Just regular watercolor paper. It's hot press. It's super cheap. I buy big pads of it in the A4 size and I cut them down to this size, and I use these for studies all the time. They're amazing. And it's so cheap that I don't feel guilty if I mess up, and I just move on to the next one. So that's a good option for you if you are new to gouache and you don't really want to spend a ton of money yet. Stuff like this can get you through the rough phase when you're first starting out, or just be really good for swatches and other things like that. And of course we need our mixing space. So when I say mixing space, I just mean something to mix on or to put your paint on. And this is another huge one that I get lots of questions on, and I do kind of change it once in a while, here and there. But basically, lately, my favorite way to do this is to this is actually a tray out of my watercolor palette. It just pops right out. And I either will put the gouache straight on here and then mix on here, or I will use a piece of Stay Wet acrylic palette paper. And by the way, all the materials I talk about that I use are listed in my favorite art supply, my favorite art gear link in the description below. So if you want to go directly to it and just see what I'm talking about, you can go there. But what I do with this is just get it wet. I dip it in the water and then put it on here, and it stays wet much longer than the plastic would. Obviously, plastic isn't going to be wet. Everything just floats on the surface of the plastic. So just with this tiny addition, this little piece of palette paper, and I put my piles of paint on there, it gives me an extra maybe even hour or more of time before my gouache gets totally dry. And throughout that process, as I'm painting, I always have a little spray bottle. I just got these at I don't know, some Tesco's or something, and they came in a 4-pack. Just spritz the paint or spritz your palette every once in a while. As soon as you start to notice your gouache is getting kind of hardening on the outside, you don't want that. Just give it a little spray, and it'll help your gouache last longer in your session. And I know everyone has their own preferences when it comes to palettes. Some people prefer those palettes that have different wells in them so you can keep your colors separate, but I like to make a big old mess, and I just put my colors on here and mix on here. And as I go, I can clean this out. The other convenient thing about the paper is I can actually lift it out, clean this off, and put my paint back on. And say I'm switching from a green area of my painting to a yellow or a red, and I don't want to cross-contaminate as much, that makes it super easy. And I do tend to keep my palette, or actually my whole setup, pretty portable like this, because I'm always switching between painting in my studio and painting outside. So if you're someone who only paints inside, I'd say you probably want a bigger palette or a bigger mixing space, because it's just easier, more convenient. But if you're like me, or you need to clean up your space a lot and change things out, something like this is perfect, in my opinion. You can also even buy sponges that go underneath this, which are made by the same brand, and that's also listed in my materials link. So yeah, that makes it last even longer, makes it stay wet even longer. In terms of storage, this is one thing that people are always interested in. It's a watercolor palette box, so it was originally made or marketed towards watercolor, but it seals and the lid comes off. I just put this piece of paper in here so I know what colors are in here. And it has a little silicone seal, I guess you'd call it. And inside I keep one of each of my main colors. And I'm always kind of changing them, and I'm also scooping them out and replenishing them or refilling them. And I actually don't keep white in here because I use so much white, and I don't ever want it to be, I want it to be liquid always. And I always use fresh white on my palette. So that's the reason there's no white in here. And it's like the convenience of this is I can just grab this and run outside and paint. So I have all my colors ready to go. It is easier to keep it moist for longer if you fill them up more, but I use it so much that mine are always running out. And some of them, if I like take this outside with me and I forget to spray it often, they do get a little bit more dry. But when it's sealed up, I always spray it before I seal it up and put everything on. And as soon as I do that, this will last months. Like I actually didn't open this for at least 3 weeks. It might have been even like 6 weeks. I don't know. It was a really long time. And I opened it up and it was fresh, like nothing, like I had just poured the paint into it. So if you can get your hands on one of these, it's great. And there are a bunch of different brands out there. I just Googled watercolor palette box and I found this one. I think it was maybe Amazon. The brand name is actually Splendy. I don't know if you can see that. Splendy, which I've never heard of before, but you'll probably find all sorts of weird brand names out there. And as long as it has a silicone seal, I think you'll be fine. Hi, Anna. Hi, Inappropriate. Hi, Charlotte. Yeah, the palette paper is a savior, especially if you paint outside, because even if I'm outside here and it's kind of humid, it still tends to dry fast, I think because there's more airflow or something. So having the gouache on a piece of palette paper, or, oh, here's another quick tip. If you don't have palette paper or you're just in a pinch, if you just really need to keep your gouache moist for longer, get a piece of a paper towel and cut it into a strip like this and spritz it with water. Just get it like slightly damp and pour your paint onto that, and that will also keep your gouache moist for longer. However, the only thing with that is I notice when I do that on wet paper towel, the paper towel soaks up some of the paint, more of the paint, which the palette paper doesn't. So, just something to keep in mind. It shouldn't be a big deal. Like, it won't be too much. I don't think it'll make a big difference. Hello, Fi or Fee. Perna, hello. Heard baking paper works well. Oh, that'd be interesting to try. Yeah, I mean, honestly, just try stuff that you have around your house. You don't have to go out and buy a ton of stuff to make a setup that works for you. So as I mentioned, you want to have paper towels. I usually either use a cloth like this and I wash it every once in a while, or just fresh paper towels. And the reason those are especially important is because water control is so important with gouache. You really want to monitor the amount of water that's in your brush. And when you're switching colors, or you find that your brush is kind of drying out too much and you want it to still be nice and wet, for me anyway, my strategy is to constantly rinse my brush and then dab it on the paper towel and then pick up more color. And that way it's constantly refreshing. It's not drying out when I don't want it to dry out, which we can talk about more later when we talk about technique, but that's a biggie. So I go through tons of cloths and paper towels during my sessions. And by the way, if you have a paper towel that you've already used, just let it dry out between sessions and you can use it again. Like I've reused some of my paper towels probably 6 times. So you don't have to see it as wasting it. Or just cut up an old t-shirt like this. Old cotton t-shirts work amazing for painting. But you really want to have that on hand. So it's ready to go when you're painting. So with storage, one thing that I've learned the hard way over the years is you have your nice tubes of paint. How do you store them so that they don't dry out? I store them in a airtight plastic bag that I think just like a kitchen bag, a sandwich bag. I've heard other people store them in the sealable jars because it kind of looks nice sitting on their desk. Or if you prefer to only use something like this, you can just squeeze your tubes into here and make sure you lovingly care for your palette box. You never want to let it dry out, or, especially if you're pouring almost all your tube into there, you don't want to let it dry out and get all crumbly. Because some people are curious about the difference between dry gouache and wet gouache out of the tube. Some companies make dry gouache, which is like a little pan and the gouache is poured in, and it's specifically meant to harden between sessions, just like watercolor. The problem with that is the second you introduce water to your gouache, you're diluting it and it's not 100% opaque. So if you like to paint with completely opaque paint, it's not possible to do that with dry gouache. It's convenient and you can still get close to 100% opacity if your gouache allows you to re-wet it really easily. Some brands are easier than others, but you'll never be 100% opaque. So it's just something to think about. And yeah, I mean, that's another personal thing in terms of brands. Like, we can talk about that soon too, but some brands re-wet much easier than others. And some of them will get all dry and crumbly and just not re-wet very well at all. If your gouache had honey in it, I will talk about that, or I guess we can talk about that now because it's on the list, but we're talking about the palette box anyway. So just a quick note on keeping your gouache in a sealed container. Some brands like mgram have honey in them, and they can, I don't want to say will always get moldy, but they can get moldy. It's interesting because for like a year and a half I've been doing gouache videos, maybe a little longer, and one of the most common questions either in my comments or like live streams and stuff are about, or people asking about why their gouache is moldy or if it gets moldy in here. Mine doesn't. Mine's Winsor Newton, and I guess it's fine. It doesn't have that issue. The most common brand I hear about getting moldy is mgram, and I'm assuming it's because it's honey. It has honey in it, which is interesting. Honey is a humectant, which means it's easier to re-wet it. And you'd think it wouldn't make it mold because it's also like antimicrobial, but I think it's because the gouache can stay wet longer. It tends to hold more water in it. And I don't know. It's just, it's a brand thing. Vader, shush. No. Sorry, guys, Vader. And I'm not saying I'm not saying Winsor Newton will never get moldy, because if you keep anything sealed for too long or it has water in it, there's potential for it. So some things that you can do to make sure that doesn't happen is you can open this up every week, spritz it a little with water, give it a good mix. I use my palette knife to mix my colors. So just a clean palette knife and wipe it off between colors, give it a good mix, and seal it back up, or at least try to use it once a week. I mean, that's the thing about this, is it's so easy to open up and use. Just paint out of this box. So it should encourage you to actually paint more often. And the other thing that I've done with my old Holbein gouache, I used to use Holbein gouache more. I actually don't have any of those tubes left. My my rose color in my Holbein tube smelled so bad. Like, it smelled like sewage. It was so gross. And every time I would use it, I would get really freaked out. And at one point I kept it sealed in my other watercolor container, and it actually grew mold. And I was like, no, this is not good. So the day I bought this box, I was kind of transitioning from Holbein to Winsor Newton. So a few of my colors were Holbein still, and I mixed in a tiny drop of clove bud oil, mixed it really well with my palette knife, and no mold. I eventually phased out my Holbein and I only use Winsor Newton now because I really like the consistency, but it worked. So you don't necessarily have to live with that fear of mold. You can do things to get rid of it or to avoid getting it. But there's all sorts of stories out there about people going in or opening up their palette box or even those big sealable palettes like people use for acrylic. And it's moldy because with wherever there's water, there's going to be life. I mean, that's the way it is. So you can do some things to kind of minimize that, but I don't have to worry about it, which is cool for me. If you really love the M-gram gouache because it has honey in it, it has that specific consistency, and it can be re-wet really nicely, really easily, try some clove bud oil, or maybe there's something else out there that you can research, just a little drop now and then, and it might work for you. Or if not, make sure you monitor it more often. Don't just close it up and leave it for like a month and expect it to be fine. You haven't had it, been happy with almost for 2 years now. Yeah, see, no, and I'm not saying anything bad about M-gram. I use M-gram watercolor and I love it because it's so easy to re-wet and it's just so creamy and wonderful. And I've never tried their gouache because I think when I was buying gouache, it was super expensive to get in Scotland. So I just haven't tried it. But you know, if you take care of your materials, if you take care of your palette box and all of that, you shouldn't have any issues. Or if you just use it straight out of the tube, which is what I do half the time, you especially won't have any issues. So don't write off a brand because of rumors like that. Like, there are ways to work around it and you can still use a wonderful brand like that. Okay, so yeah, there's probably going to be lots of comments about about mold and ideas that you can do to get around it. So make sure you read the chat or look at the comments in the future if you're having issues with that. we can kind of work together to think of ways to help people get through that problem. The last few materials I want to mention are pretty, I mean, you don't have to have them, but you guys probably notice in my videos I use blue tape. This is 3M. It's called multi-purpose painter's tape. Other times I've seen it branded as Scotch blue painter's tape. But basically the 3M brand is what I always look for because I've been using it for so many years and I've never had issues with it. Like, once it's on the paper, I barely ever get it doesn't bleed and it doesn't tear my paper as much as other tapes that I've tried. So if you like to tape off the edges of your sketchbook, so let's just take a look. It's really fun to do stuff like this. You can tape off one part of your page and paint outside the box. So basically you'd paint inside here, take off the tape, and then paint outside of that. Or you can do little studies like this, like have a value study and your color study next to each other. Or obviously I have lots of them that are just full page. So tape is a wonderful thing to have, and you can use it for so many different paint mediums like watercolor, gouache. This one is my favorite. It withstands all the abuse that I throw at it. And you can get it in different thicknesses too. And by the way, I'm not sponsored by any companies. I just recommend stuff that I personally love and use. And you can find links to and descriptions of all the materials I mentioned in my favorite art painting supply or art supply link in the description. Otherwise, the only other materials I can think of are, I mentioned the palette knife, which I love using for mixing, which we can also talk about soon, but mixing with a palette knife will not dry out your palette or your gouache mixes before you start painting. Whereas if you mix everything with your brush, your bristles your bristles are almost immediately going to start absorbing that, depending on if they're synthetic versus natural. and your bristles are going to get clogged up with the paint and the moisture, and it's much harder, I think, to make a clean, smooth mix and then paint with it with a brush. Whereas if you mix with a palette knife and then you dip your clean brush into it, you just get a nice smooth brush stroke. So definitely recommend. Plus, if you're like me and you like to get really weird and creative with your mark making, palette knives you can actually paint with your palette knife using gouache. As long as it doesn't get too thick on your paper, as long as you're not like piling up the paint on your paper like you would with oil paint or something. But you can make really interesting palette knife marks. You can scratch into your paint like grasses. I find scraping away like that with my grasses is awesome. It makes really nice little tiny marks. Sorry. Throat is dry. So yeah, you can do that with an X-Acto knife, with a nail. I don't know, like you find some unique things out there and make some interesting marks. Just like pick up a bunch of random objects and see if you can make some interesting marks with them. It's kind of fun. Or even like an old pen that doesn't work, you can just use the pointy tip to like make scratches or marks on your painting, because if you do paint a little bit thicker with gouache, you can actually, make marks into it. I think I actually have a YouTube video about that, like using a palette knife for gouache. I think the last one is varnish, but we're going to actually talk about varnish and finishing things at the end, so I'll save that for the end. If you're interested in varnish or sealing your gouache, I'll put like a little, I'll make like chapter marks after the video's done, and you can jump to whatever you're looking for. Okay, so let's just move on to more specifically talking about paint. And I think I'll start with one of the most asked questions, and that is, what is the best gouache, or what is the best brand? What is the difference between the brands? What brand should I buy? There's a million ways that people ask that question, but they basically just want to know, like they're getting ready to start their gouache journey. They're like, just tell me what to buy. Just tell me. And I'm like, okay, I get it, but it is kind of personal. And I have used Holbein and Winsor Newton. I have tried a little bit of Schminke, I think, made a gouache. And my friend had it, and I tried like a couple brush strokes with it, but I don't have any opinions about it. I only can tell you my opinions about Holbein and Winsor Newton. Holbein is, oh my God, it's amazing. Like, it is so packed with pigment. It's crazy, but it's way more expensive here. Winsor Newton is the most affordable one for me in terms of like what the quality I get for my money. Because the main difference between the brands out there are how much pigment is in it versus how much filler, and I think the quality overall of the pigment and the fillers. So some brands, like we mentioned, M. Graham, they will use honey in their binder, which is the stuff that holds all the pigment together and lets you actually spread it on the paper. That honey is going to make it really easy to re-wet. It's also going to make it, I think, a little bit creamier, and it's a huge draw for some people. Holbein, in my opinion, was a little bit thicker. It had a super intense pigment load, meaning it's like there was no filler. It was just pure pigment. It felt like I was painting with pastels. It was amazing. And I really loved it for a while, but the more I tried Winsor Newton, the Winsor Newton gouache is a little bit more liquidy. I don't know how else to describe it except liquidy. And I love that. For my personal style and my technique, it is perfect because I need my paint to move quickly. I need it to perform in a certain way. So I didn't I bought Winsor Newton just to try it. At first I only had their white gouache because it was a cheap tube of big white gouache that I could get. And then I slowly started trying the other colors and realized, like, holy crap, like here in Scotland, I can get a few tubes like sometimes I can find sales. Each tube is like 4 to 6 pounds, which is really great. Some brands can get pretty pricey depending on where you live. So if you have access to an online art store, check for sales and maybe try 1 or 2 brands before you settle on, or actually I would recommend trying more brands. But if you find a brand that you love, just go for it. Like, don't apologize. Just use it. And I know a lot of people ask about Arteza and Himi. I think it's called Himi Gouache, Himi. I've never tried them, and all I can say, you know, from what I've seen online and what I've heard people talking about it, like you'll have to go do your own research or try them yourself, but you do want to look at the light fast ratings of your paint if you plan on selling your art. I think it's a responsibility that you have as an artist. If you're selling your art, an original art piece, and the buyer doesn't have a clue about painting or like what light fast means or anything like that, like how to make sure their painting lasts a long time. If you're using materials that are not professional grade and you're using pigments that fade over time, either tell your buyer or don't use them because it's irresponsible. So just no matter what brands you use, because there's tons of brands out there. Holbein makes colors that are not light fast. Winsor Newton makes colors that are not light fast. It's up to you as the artist to find the colors that are light fast if you plan on selling. And I personally think it's kind of fun to like have that knowledge, to delve really deep into that research and figure out like, what colors am I using? Are they going to last a long time? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, light fast basically means, you know, is it going to fade over time? Some colors turn into gray, some colors turn into brown, some just get like very desaturated. So it's important to look it up. Yeah, I mean, there's like a whole lot of information out there. I have a few videos about that, or it's in a few of like my palette videos. So if you're interested, send me a message or leave a comment and I can point you towards those. Because it's a lot of information. Like, you can go really deep into it. Okay, so the difference, we kind of talked about the difference between the brands, and I'm sure that people are going to have comments, and let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. You find that Winsor Permanent White is shiny when it's dried on its own. Is that just your tube or is it normal? I've never really noticed. Maybe if you're using it really, really thick, it might be a little shiny. I think I've seen that with Holbein when I use some of my colors really thick. Some of them had like a different finish to them. Arteza is a great starter paint, good for the price. Yeah, if you're just starting out, I know it's, you want people to just tell you what to buy just to make it easy, but honestly, buy what you can afford. Try a few different brands as much as you can, and just go experiment. I mean, there's no right answer, and everyone is going to have a different opinion about what gouache is best, or any kind of paint for that matter. So, Melanie Woods, I've used Graham watercolors for 5 years, never had any mold. Yeah, I've never had any mold in my my watercolors, and I use, I think, 3 different tubes of Graham. So it just depends how you store it. It depends how you use it. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on your environment. So not any one brand in particular, I think, is going to be a problem. It's a lot. It's more about user. I want to say user error, but maybe that's the wrong term. I don't know if you know what I mean. Phi Squared asks, whites, zinc, or titanium? I'm about to get into that next. So I have permanent white and zinc white. And permanent white is basically titanium white. And you can, maybe the different brands have different names for them or something, but basically zinc white is slightly more transparent and it makes cleaner mixes. Titanium white is like crazy bright white, more reflective white, and is better for making more opaque mixes. But I do find both of them have very similar results. It's like they have a slightly different tint to them. And I actually went through that. I talked about that in my Skillshare class for the beginner gouache class. I showed like them side by side and stuff. So I prefer to mix with my zinc white because my colors, I feel like I just get better mixes. And I like to use my permanent white as like the bright highlights or anything that's like on the top layer that's going to be kind of the final touches on the painting. So it's not like you have to use two different whites. For the longest time, like years, I only used permanent white, and those old paintings, like I didn't feel like anything was wrong with them. I don't know. It might just be like so minor that it doesn't really matter, but you could do some experimenting for yourself. See if it makes a difference for you, and see if it. I don't know, if you're just using the white, one might be, I think the zinc white feels a little bit cooler to me, if I remember. One of them is going to have like a slightly warmer tint versus a slightly cooler tint. So it could make a difference in your painting. That's up to you. Light fastness is a bit overstated. People do not sell their art, and most people don't sell their art, and frankly, all the old painters used fugitive paints. Yeah, but personally, I don't want a painting that I sell. I do sell a lot of original art. I don't want any of my buyers to come back to me in a few years and be like, hey, so that painting you did of the sunset, like all the vivid colors are now gray or brown. Like it would feel really crappy, and I'm not going to allow that. So I actually care, and I do put stock in that. But the thing is, like, once you research what colors are light fast, just buy those colors and don't worry about it. Just move on with your life and keep painting. It's not that hard, and there's so much information out there about light fast ratings that it's easy to find what you need. If you paint in your sketchbook, why worry about light fastness? The book is closed anyway. It's up to you. If it's your sketchbook and it's just for you for learning purposes, then it really doesn't matter, and it probably won't make a difference because it's not exposed to UV light. So, yeah, just logic. All right, next we're going to talk about what colors you should buy, because that's another question I get a lot, and I kind of mentioned this when I first started the stream. You need 5 colors, and that's you really only need 4 colors, but if you're gonna buy 4, just buy one more. The primary colors, any red you want, any blue you want, any yellow you want, get a red, a yellow, and a blue. Primary colors. You can mix almost anything with primary colors. White is very important for gouache because that affects our values. Black is a really convenient color to have to get really, really dark darks. You can go way further than that, like I do. I have many, many colors. This isn't even all of my colors, but it's the one I use the most often. If you don't like using black in your art, instead you could buy burnt umber and Prussian blue, and if you mix those two and even mix a little bit of permanent alizarin crimson into there, those 3 colors combined make the most gorgeous black, and I love it. Or you can buy Pyroline green, which is a slightly green black color, and it's gorgeous with landscapes. Obviously there are a few different types of yellows, there's many different blues, there's many different reds, and it's so personal that no one can really tell you. A lot of people say buy cad red, buy cad yellow, buy ultramarine, because those are just like the classics. I hate cads. I use cadmium free lemon yellow, and to me that's like the perfect yellow. But I hate cad red. Like, it's just personal. It's nothing against anyone who uses it. I prefer permanent alizarin crimson. My favorite color, my favorite primers, if I only had to choose 3, would be permanent alizarin crimson, cadmium-free lemon yellow, and ultramarine, maybe Prussian blue. If I don't know, I love Prussian blue, but something along those lines. So they're not like the. Everyone's gonna have a different opinion about this. So my advice is to start off with any three. From there, you'll start to see your limits, because the first thing you're gonna want to do, which is what we're gonna talk about next. But basically, the first thing you're gonna want to do is make a color mixing chart. Through that, you will learn what colors are possible and what aren't, because even though you can kind of mix any color with the primaries, some colors you won't be able to achieve certain colors, like really vivid turquoises, or like certain colors that actually, this is a perfect example. I just started doing tropical paintings, and I was having the darndest time getting bright, vivid, like neon green and vivid turquoise with my primaries. So before that, I was doing the snow paintings, and like, can you see how muted this is compared to, so see how muted that is basically compared to that. So those blues, very different. Even the greens, like, let's find an example. Well, basically what I'm just trying to say is, yes, you can mix green, you can mix purple, whatever, with the primaries, but it's like, what kind of green are you trying to mix? What kind of purple are you trying to mix? If that matters to you, you might want to branch out and get a few more colors, because certain reds will give you certain mixes, certain blues will give you certain mixes, or you might have to just buy a tube of one beautiful color that you can't mix. So like, a phthalo green or a phthalo blue is going to give you a much more vivid, intense mix. Or there's like this color, cobalt turquoise light. I don't know if the camera's picking that up very well, but that color is insanely gorgeous, and it's just so unique that it's worth buying. It's worth using that color. As much as I love mixing with only my primaries, like, there are times when I just have to get it. But I do want to point out that the reason I like permanent alizarin crimson, if I start with that color, it's a little bit more pink on the pink side of things versus like the orangey red, which a cad red is a little more orangey red in my opinion. So if I start with the pinkish red, I can add yellow and it becomes the kind of orangey red. So I can make cad red almost with that color, with those two. It just gives me more range, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So I love having that option, and I rarely use red, like bright red in my paintings anyway. So for me, it doesn't really matter. I just use it to mix. But if you paint a lot of architecture or people, you might want to have specific reds or blues or whatever for your work. And I know that's like a long-winded answer, but it's important to think about. And it's honestly so we could go into the whole cadmium thing and the toxicity of colors, but we're not going to go into that because I've already talked about that in the past. In my palette video that I put out this past summer, I guess I'll try to link it somewhere in the description, but it's more about the colors I can create, like the kind of mixes I can create. And here is a perfect example. So if you have time for this, or I think you should make time for this when you first buy colors, I think it's really important to get familiar with your colors as much as you can. So taking all of your colors and making mixing charts, making swatch sheets, and really seeing how far you can push your mixes. So these are all my permanent, these are kind of out of order, but you've probably seen me use these in some of my other gouache live streams. I use them to like decide what colors I'm going to use for a landscape. So, permanent alizarin crimson mixed with all of my colors. And then I have quinacridone magenta mixed with all my colors, and cad free red mixed with all my colors. And this is just a really awesome side-by-side comparison to see the difference between the mixes. So on the right, we have the permanent alizarin crimson. On the left, we have cad-free red. And you can see the cad-free red leans a little bit more brown, and this one leans a little bit more purple. So yes, they make a difference. Like which red you buy is going to make a difference in your landscapes, like how the kind of colors that you can create. So I think, to me, it's fascinating. I make so many color charts and so many swatch sheets because I am just obsessed with learning about color. I'm not saying you have to do this, but I think it helps to get a better understanding of what's possible with your colors. And I have swatch and color mixing videos like throughout my if you go look at my gouache playlist, they should be in there, or I might even have a swatch playlist if you need help with those. But doing this and this, I think, is like the first step. So when you first buy your paint, whichever brand you went with, whatever colors, make a swatch sheet, make a color mixing chart. And this is actually an example, or the one that I used to take outside with me. So it's foldable, it can throw it in my bag. It gets dirty, but that's fine. But basically just all of my colors, peer out of the tube, mix with white. So from mixed with white, as light as I can make it so it's still visible, all the way down to pure straight out of the tube. And that's the variety I can get with just one tube. And I do that with all of my colors so that when I'm outside painting, I can just like look up at the ocean and I see like, oh, what is that green? And then I can like look on my chart and, oh, I need that green. So it just like takes the guesswork out of it. Or you can do it in your studio as well. Like having, you make these charts and then you have them next to you for reference as you paint. It's really, really convenient. Sorry, I'm just gonna make sure. Okay, so if you are asking questions in chat or have a question or have a demo request, save it for the end. I'll have a little section at the end that we can do all of that, because it's really hard to keep track of everything as I'm going. And if you are here in the future watching the replay, ask in the comments. I'll do my best, and I'm sure other people will help answer things as well. Okay, so yes, learning your colors, we talked about that. I think next we'll get into basic techniques and water control, because they kind of go hand in hand. And we're gonna paint together. So if you're you're out there, you want to paint along, go for it. I'll just use my flat brush. And I'm going to use my hot press paper. These are just scrap pieces of paper I have lying around. Some colors, I forgot to mention this, but some colors out there are a little bit more transparent naturally. So for instance, permanent alizarin crimson, that's like a tongue twister. Permanent alizarin crimson is a little bit more transparent, and I struggle getting really thick brush strokes with this, and it's rare that I need a thick brush stroke of this because I just don't use bright red all the time, but it's perfect for mixing. I feel like it gives me really clean mixes when I need it, like mixing it with yellow. I'll get the most wonderful oranges. We could actually do that now. But as I said, gouache dries really fast, so the first thing you want to do is set up your palette. If you have palette paper, or if not, like get your little paper towel and set it on there. I just dip it in the water and then set it on my palette, and it just kind of like naturally sticks to it. And let's put some red and the yellow. And as you go, don't forget about this. Your best friend. When you notice your paint is kind of getting a little more stiff, just give it a little spritz. It really only takes 1 or 2 sprays. You don't want it to be like drenched, because then it's just getting too diluted. But we're going to talk about using diluted gouache versus thick gouache. And I have this in many of my videos. I also have this, like, I go into this more in the Skillshare classes. But basically, when you're first starting out, this is like the trickiest thing. Water control is the trickiest thing, and it's so crucial for gouache. And the problem with it is that anyone can sit here and tell you that water control is important, but it doesn't matter. The second you put your brush into that paint and put it on the paper, that's when it, like, you realize, oh my god, I need a lot of practice. And it took me a long time to find my balance, because you want to have, usually, depending on your technique, you want to have like the least amount of water involved in order to make the paint do what you want. I usually start with a really diluted layer, which you'll see in almost all of my videos. So that's different, like starting with a almost watercolory type layer. But not everyone wants to do that, or in other situations that's not desired. So learning how to use just enough water on your brush to make the paint do what you want, that's where it comes in, where the practice comes in. Wet palettes like you would for miniature painting. Yeah, I have those. I use those for my oil painting. I used to use them for acrylic as well. So those are great. Those like sponges that come with those, you can put the sponge and then you put the palette paper on top of it. I used to cut those sponges down and use them on my tray, my mixing tray, because they're just awesome. And they keep your gouache moist for longer. Yeah, so diluting the gouache versus thick gouache. I know this is gonna I hope this isn't like too advanced if someone is first starting out and has never painted before with gouache, but my strategy, actually I'll zoom back out. My strategy is to fix my screen. How's that for a strategy? Bear with me. I want to move this over. Okay, there we go. Fix the screen so it's more centered. My strategy is to constantly dip my brush in my water to replenish it. So basically I'll have my cloth here on the side somewhere. I will clean my brush in the water. So just clean water. Dab it on the paper towel or the cloth, and you can kind of see it's still a little bit shiny. Like there's still a little bit of water in there. If I separate it, you can see the bristles are still kind of sticking together. That's like the perfect amount of water. I don't want it dripping, and I don't want it to be too dry. And that's, again, everyone's brush is going to be different, and you just have to continue using them to get used to that. So once I do that and I have like my perfect start, I can dip it in the gouache and try to get my brush. See, first I do a test. Usually I just do a like test mark and see if I have enough gouache or enough water. And basically what I'm trying to avoid most times is super streaky or like accidentally getting too much of paint on one side of the brush, or like chunkiness. And it's so hard to do this out of context. Like I'm not painting a landscape now, but even just doing your swatch sheets, you'll notice it makes a difference, like how much water is in there. So if there's not enough water, this is gonna happen. See, the yellow is all broken up. That's because there was not enough water, not enough paint. As I was doing my brush stroke, it dried out so much that it let the paper show through a lot. The red one is much smoother. However, inside that brush stroke, you can see there's all those little streaks. Even that is going to be an issue. However, I will say in a landscape, I'm brushing over the same spot so many times that something like that is never going to happen. It's not going to be visible. Nothing compares to actually using your supplies. Yeah, and it's so frustrating, right? Like, I wish I could just be like, do this, and then it's perfect. But but in a way, that's the fun of it, you know? Like you're on that journey of exploration. So finding that balance, making the perfect brush stroke, it obviously depends on what you're painting. If you're using like, if you're blending things on the paper versus putting colors next to each other, and if you want solid colors versus dry brush, really quick, or actually I'll just do it on here. So dry brush is an actual technique that we use to create visual texture, and it's my favorite thing about gouache because you can get such strong dry brush. So how it works is you can put your paint down, and what I try to do is let my brush naturally dry out on the paper. So sometimes it's about timing. It's like if I know I want one area to show a lot of dry brush marks, I try to make sure by the time my brush gets to that point, it's starting to dry out. So as it sweeps across the paper, all of that texture is showing up. But again, it's tricky to get to that point. So it's again going to be a lot of practice. I'm sorry I keep saying that. But I personally think it's fun. It's a challenge, and you can even do it when you're layering things. But those are techniques those are brush strokes that can actually like tell the story. If you're painting sand on a beach, for instance, having a lot of that texture show through is actually a strategy for kind of alluding to the fact that there's all that sand, or maybe pebbles, or I don't know, so many different things. You can use it for a lot of different things. Here's another example. Letting like the glimmer of the reflection, that background color is the bright orange and the blue is the dry brush on top, but some of that background color is showing through, and it just kind of, at first glance, your eye just sees reflection or glimmer on the water. And so it's I personally think it's the best thing about gouache, and so much fun to play with. So, you know, keep it in mind as like a tool in your toolbox. And then of course, if you are doing wet into wet, I do both. I do wet into wet and dry brush techniques on all of my paintings. So wet into wet is you have wet paint down, whether it's super diluted or not, I don't care, but you have wet paint and you're painting wet paint into that wet paint. So this is going to give you much smoother blends. Why don't I use some colors that are more noticeable? You guys can probably barely see the mixes on there. Like, the beautiful thing about gouache is that it's so versatile. You can combine watercolor techniques with like acrylic or oil painting techniques. So that's wet, and I'm going to sweep in some more wet gouache into there. And as the brush starts to dry out, you see some of the dry brush marks, and in there you have the blend. The tricky thing is that gouache is forever blendable. Like, even if it's dry on the paper, you can blend into it. So that can be a strategy that you utilize in your landscapes, or it can be your downfall. Like it happens to me when I don't want it to sometimes, and it's really frustrating. But let's say we have like a solid square and we let that dry. Actually, let's do a smaller brush. And we have another square next to it. So here's an example of two paints that act very differently. My blue paint is a little bit thicker than my red paint. My red paint feels very transparent, and I usually need more layers. So once these dry, we'll give it a minute actually. I'll just show you an example up here. Dry brush is, this brush is actually wet, but the paint is soaking into the bristles, and the longer I hold it out in the air, the more it's drying. So as I sweep it onto the paper, it almost feels like there's no water left. And it can be so confusing and weird when you're first starting out. You're like, why is it doing that? But try to see it as a blessing. Try to see it as the good thing about gouache, that it allows you to do that. As these are drying, they might seem dry and you're like, okay, those are down, I'm good to go, I can start layering on top of it. But as soon as we start adding another color, like, we'll just go with white because it'll be the most obvious. As soon as you start painting on top of that, your white is going to blend into what's there because it's picking up that color underneath it. Because gouache never permanently dries, it never permanently cures like other paint does. Like, you can get acrylic gouache. Acrylic gouache is permanent. It dries like acrylic, but it has the matte look of gouache. So you can use this to your advantage. You can blend into a color. You can get like a nice gradient by doing that. Or you can try to paint, if you're layering gouache, you can try to paint really thick on top of your dry gouache and make sure none of that underlayer comes through. But I think it's really fun to use all the techniques in my paintings. Like, I try to get a little wet into wet, a little dry brush, a little bit of blending, a little bit of layering. And oops, my phone just buzzed and scared me. And even though I have that white on there, I can still come back in with blue and blend into that. So now I'm going to get like a light lavender color. I'm trying to hold it at an angle so it doesn't glare for you guys. So again, it's like, to me, it's the beauty of gouache. It's the versatility of gouache. When you do want to actually layer, that's when water control, again, is really important to consider, because if your brush is wet, you can actually ruin it. Like, if you just made a gradient that you are really happy with and then you come back in with a wet brush or accidentally splash it, all that work is gone. Like, you can actually lift it away. You can kind of see how much comes up with that, which is really frustrating sometimes. So if you want to layer on top of gouache, you need the least amount of water you can possibly manage. And, well, actually that won't reveal. Let's just pretend for some reason I want to put yellow on top of there. My brush is almost dry and I'm using a very generous amount of yellow and I try to disturb it as little as possible. So I have the least amount of water as I can manage, and I try to use as few brush strokes as I can, because the more I disturb that layer underneath, the more this yellow is going to blend with it. Which in this case is awful, because look at the muddy mess that it's making. So layering gouache is a little bit trickier, but it is possible if you are very careful about your amount of water that's in there, and plan ahead, think about your brush strokes ahead of time, and think, like, be confident in them. Don't just put it somewhere, because the more you touch it, the more you mess with it, it's going to blend with whatever is under it. Hey, Holly. Okay. For gradients, one of the fun... Let's go with... This one's a little easier to see. This is yellow ochre, which is like a nice thick gouache. A nice thick yellowish earthy color. Excuse me. And I have red on there already. Actually, might need a little more red. So, gradients, there's a couple ways you can do it. If you want to use, so a lot of times in my landscape paintings, I'll do like a soft gradient in the background with diluted gouache. And I can either spray my paper and get it wet, just like I would with watercolor. Or I can try to I can paint a little bit thicker if I want like super intense colors. So since that's a little bit harder, we can try that first. But what I like to do is start with one color and lay it down on the paper. And then I don't clean my brush off, or I maybe dab it just a tiny bit in the water to kind of refresh it slightly. I get my other color and sweep it from the right to the left. So I basically cover that first color, and it means that there's a little bit less obvious separation, a little bit more overlap. And then if I need to, I can come back with one more layer, because again, permanent alizarin crimson is a little bit transparent, so it doesn't quite hold its shape as much or hold its color as much. Like it kind of can be blended away easily. So doing it as quickly as possible, so basically it's wet into wet, and quick brush strokes all the same direction, either vertical, horizontal, whatever, just as long as I'm not crossing as much, because that'll give like strange streaks that'll be really distracting. So it's more just a big brush. Depending on if you want it really diluted, add more water. Otherwise, just enough water to make the paint flow, and start one color on the left, one color on the right, and kind of sweep them into each other. There's also ways you could do it, like, so let's just say we have some blue, light blue. And we'll go with light red. So pink, basically. We'll put them next to each other. What happens if we did that on a painting and we suddenly realize we want them to be a gradient? We want them to blend into each other. It's easy enough. Basically what I try to do is, if you can remember what you used for each mix, it's better, which it should be easy because you just did it. But basically the blue, I get a little mixture of that and a little mixture of the red, and I try to make that even mix, and then I just start in the middle. And then I sweep to the left, and then I start in the middle and I sweep to the right. And the more you lay in those brush strokes, the more you kind of blend to the left, blend to the right, your separation should disappear. You might have to go over it a few times, but it's possible. What else? Let's see. If you are, again, going to be more, if you want it to be more diluted, you get your paper wet first. You can treat it like watercolor. So, for instance, up here we have the blue. The only thing is when you use it really watered down, it sits in place a little bit more. Not quite as flowy as watercolor is. So if you do that and you kind of tilt your paper and you let it flow, you're going to see a lot of watercolor effects, which can be good, depends on what you're looking for. But then you can come back with that same technique and just blend back and forth up. Lost a little bit of my blue. And that's going to give you a nice watery blend, and that's so diluted and so minimal that it'll be easier to paint on top of without blending into it. The more paint you have on the underlayer, the more likely your top layers are going to start mixing with it. So it's another reason I really like using like a watered down layer just to start off. Do you clean the brush between to get new colors? You had issues with that. Yeah, so I'm not sure if you can tell how much I'm dipping it in the water, but it's almost like a habit. It's like I don't even notice that I'm doing it, but I'm constantly dipping it in the water and dabbing it on my paper towel. Usually between mixing and picking up a new color, I'll do that. And sometimes even while I'm painting a certain color, not even just to keep it clean, but also because the bristles dry out so quick and they'll get clogged up. So if you're ever painting and you notice like you have a lot of paint on your brush, but it's not going anywhere, like it's just kind of getting stuck and you're ending up with dry brush texture when you don't really want it, that's the perfect sign that you don't have enough water. Or that your bristles are actually clogged up with either dried paint, or they just need to be refreshed basically. So that's just a quick dip in the water, quick wipe on the paper towel, and even if there's still paint left over in there, it'll flow smoother. So you'll get cleaner brush strokes, or you'll be able to spread it further. All right, so I mentioned the color mixing charts, and doing, honestly, like making a color mixing chart, and I have a bunch of those videos if you don't know how to make them, but this is another amazing way to practice water control. And it might not seem like it, but just making color mixing charts or swatch sheets, like each brush stroke, you're gonna realize like, oh, I have too much water, or oh, I don't have enough water. And after however many squares this is, like you get more and more familiar with it. So that's my recommendation when you first pick up your new tubes, you first get started painting, make those charts, make the swatch sheets. And again, it's so beneficial because you learn your colors as well. And if you guys are interested in doing like a swatch sheet together, let me know, because that could easily be another stream. It could be, or another video. I already have so many, I feel like it's like overkill, but you know, just throwing that out there. Let me know if you're interested in that. Yeah, so water control we talked about as I was going through that, but I think we're almost on to, we're going to talk about style really quick, and then how to finish, like varnishing and framing and things like that. And I'll also share some learning resources that I recommend, or that I used, and artists that I love who use gouache, who inspire me so much, and I hope it will inspire you. So pretty soon I will open up the floor for any question you can possibly think of. There are no dumb questions, or any kind of like demonstration that you need me to go over again, or something I haven't shown before. So think about those, and we'll get to those really soon. But I do want to talk about style, because style, it's one of those weird things, like finding your art style, that's like a whole video topic in itself, right? And I feel like with gouache, style, your technique can like guide your style really easily. So whether you use gouache watered down, whether you use it thick, whether you blend on the paper, whether you put colors next to each other without blending them, all of that, like the techniques might guide your style. But you can also look at styles that you love. Like if you ever saw a painting you love, a gouache painting, and it just knocks your socks off and you're like, oh my God, how do I do that? Like, I thought we could look at a few examples together and maybe talk about how they achieved what they achieved, and ways that you can start looking at art to find, to guide your practice basically. Like, not that you necessarily want to go copy someone's style, but how does that, learning how other people do what they do can just open up your mind to new possibilities. With that, I will open my iPad. We'll talk about, this will kind of go straight into the next topic too. Artists that I love, that inspire me, that I will hope inspire you. Okay, so we're gonna put this on Oops. There we go. Okay, so you guys can see that, right? So this is my Pinterest board called Glorious Gouache, and I just collect gouache paintings and gouache artists that I absolutely love. I think I also pin some of my own to that one, depending on what I'm painting. But there are so many different styles with gouache, and because it's such a versatile medium, I think you can see a huge variety in just a few of these. So let's just look really quick. There are some artists that I follow that do something that I would call more like illustrative or 2D. So they aren't necessarily trying to create ultra hyper realistic paintings of something. They are using it in a very stylized way. Like it might look a little bit flatter. They use bigger, chunkier brush strokes, and the colors are next to each other, not necessarily all blended into each other. And I think that's one of the most gorgeous ways to use gouache. I personally don't use it that way, but I love looking at art that uses it that way. And actually this artist, Kat, does a lot of that, and not just with gouache, but you can go check out their work if you're interested in that style. And if you are interested in doing this, one of the really it takes a lot of knowledge about color and light, first of all. So be patient with yourself, because as you learn a new medium, if you aren't familiar with how to render color and light in an environment, it can still be frustrating, but you'll get there. Just keep studying, keep learning, keep studying, study from life, paint from reference photos if you have to. So another artist that does that kind of maybe slightly more illustrative style, or very stylized, I guess I would say, is P-chan. That's how they go online, and you can go look up their art. Awesome, beautiful artwork, and really, really creative use of color, really creative use placement of color, and that to me is so inspiring because it's so different from my style. I absolutely love that. And okay, let's go back. I'm kind of like blending this topic into the artists that I love, so I'll just go through some of them that I really, really love, that I admire, that I think you guys should kind of look into, just because it, like I said, it opens your mind to new possibilities with gouache. Let's go down to the bottom. You probably all know Lena Revo. I think that's how you say her name, Lena Revo. You probably all know them because they are a YouTube streamer, and they do oil painting and gouache, as well as other things. And they have videos that are really, really great if you're learning. But another really good example of creative placement of light and color, I seriously admire how they use light in their paintings. Their paintings just are so luminous to me. It's amazing. And even just a sketch like this, it's not even a fully painted sketch. It has the perfect amount of information to get the point across. And I love how gouache looks on toned paper or colored paper. So it's another thing to consider. I showed you earlier a little bit in my toned paper beige sketchbook how the gouache looks, and I don't think I've ever tried it on gray or black paper, but I've heard other people doing that, and obviously here you can see how pretty it is. And then we have the master, the god himself, Nathan Fowkes, who, oh my gosh, I worship this man. Seriously. Him and James Gurney, hands down, worship. So Nathan Fowkes, which I'll talk about in a second, his class in a second, but Nathan Fowkes has a ton of examples of creative use of brush strokes and mark making. So not only is he a master of color and light, but his like these little studies, they're this big. Some of them are tiny. They're like 2 inches by 3 inches or something. And maybe like, I don't know, 50 brushstrokes or less. And he can tell the story. And so studying work like this to me it blows my mind, because I'm like, how does this happen in just a few brushstrokes? Like, it's gorgeous. But that, again, it goes hand in hand with having a strong understanding of color, of light in the landscape, and it doesn't happen overnight. So don't be hard on yourself if you can't achieve it. Like, this is a master who's been doing it for a very long time, but you can be inspired by it, and you can see how, like, one, maybe, I don't know, like, I'm trying to find an example of some of his work. You can just tell there's like so few brushstrokes, but it's just enough. It tells the story. So again, go check out Nathan's work. And James Gurney, a lot of you probably know, I hope so, another god in the art world. But James has many videos and many tutorials out there, but is also another master of light and color, and the way that I think he often uses casein paint and tempera and some other interesting paints that I've never tried, but does use a lot of gouache. Also, I want to quickly mention that Nathan Fowkes, probably James Gurney, and other artists they were the ones that first showed me what gouache is, but also that you can use watercolor and gouache combined really easily. So something that Nathan does a lot is he'll take a watercolor palette outside and just white gouache, and all he does is he mixes like usual, but if he needs something to be opaque, he just adds a little bit of white gouache, and so they play so nicely together, and you can still get really bright, vivid, opaque mixes because you're adding the white gouache, and then the rich, deep colors whenever you need them as well. So it's something to consider if you're like a watercolor person and you're transitioning into gouache. That could be a really easy way for you to start out. These are some more examples from Nathan. Sorry, I have a lot of Nathan's work saved on here because it's just so beautiful. Here's another interesting take on gouache. I recently discovered this artist, and Thomas Paquette, I probably am mispronouncing the last name, but they have in my opinion, an interesting way of layering and letting color show through in certain ways. Like, if you look at the edges of the tree and the edges of the rocks, there's a lot of vivid, deep purplish blue just peeking through, and it almost becomes like this outline effect. I don't even know how to describe it, but like, I sometimes will start with a bright background and let some of that background show through in the end. And it's its own style. Like, it creates its own look in the artwork, but it's something to think about. It's something to consider. And I have a lot of different styles of art posted on here. Here's another James Gurney. James Gurney also does a lot of videos about limited palettes, and he talks about, I think he has a whole class on using triads, but a lot of his videos, like, he'll just be like, let's use 2 colors today. And you're like, what? Okay. And he paints this masterpiece with 2 colors plus white added. So much is possible, you guys. It's just depends on what you're looking for. So let's see. Since I've already moved on to like artists that I love, Tommy Kim is another artist. They do a ton of videos on Instagram as well. I think they use the Reels feature. So if you ever want to see how they paint what they paint, go check out their Instagram. Tommy, I think it's Tommy Kim or Tommy.Kim or something like that. But if you search Tommy Kim, you'll find it. They have quite a big following. And Heather Een is another amazing artist who I follow now. They do a lot of oil painting as well. Actually, all of these artists, I think, do oil painting and gouache and other things. So yeah, they're just good at everything, it seems. But I love how Heather captures they fruit, especially like still life paintings from life, basically. Like learning, you can learn so much about color and light that way, and it really inspires me to do it myself. I also have a couple of these landscapes by Ello Wobig, and they are, to me, they're absolutely gorgeous. I love the looseness of them, the expressiveness of the brushstrokes. Like from a distance, you can clearly tell what it is, but if you like really zoom in, it's so crazy and abstract. And that's some of my favorite that's like my favorite kind of art. So I just wanted to share a few of those with you guys. Of course, I can't forget one of the other masters. Let's search Mike Hernandez, who goes by Squatch Gouache on Instagram. Mike Hernandez has tons of tutorials out there and workshops and all sorts of cool things. But again, it's another very expressive way of painting. Very, very accurate color placement and light. Like they know their color and light, just like James and Nathan. I mean, just they get it. And that's because they've been doing it for a long time and studying from life, it makes you better, just hands down. So if you need proof, there it is. But they do oil painting as well, and digital, actually. I just noticed recently that digital is a big thing, and it looks fascinating. It's like this chunky brushstroke kind of thing. Mike is amazing. But another great artist to go check out for inspiration. So now that I've kind of shown you a few different things, a few different artists that I love, pretty much all of them have learning resources. For instance, I took the Nathan Fowkes, what is it called? Landscape Sketching in Watercolor and Gouache. It's a schoolism.com class, and I did the self-guided one. It wasn't like the full class with him giving feedback or anything, but even just like the basic version of it was amazing. And just the way he describes how color and light plays in the environment and shows how he captures it is so worth it. So I highly recommend that one. Mike Hernandez, again, has really great tutorials on his website. You could just Google it, you'll find his website. I think the main one is creating drama with color and light or something like that. And if you look at his work, you can see what he means by drama. And of course, James Gurney has a ton of, I don't even know, like dozens maybe, has a ton of tutorials. And I think you can actually download them all on his website. So if you Google James Gurney, you'll find his website, go to his video section, and there's a lot of gouache tutorials. I also have Skillshare classes and Patreon videos about this topic if you guys are interested in. But there's also plenty of resources on YouTube. So, don't just spend all your time watching tutorials. You do need to put the brush to the paper. So like, it's tempting, I know, to like go just absorb all the information as much as you can before you pick up the brush so that you feel confident. But don't let that be like, don't let it stop you from actually practicing. And if you guys ever need any feedback or help, I have a Discord chat. You can go post progress in there. You can ask questions. We have a lot of artists in there, and everyone, like so many talented artists. I'm not the only one who answers questions. So, if you're just starting this journey, like definitely reach out to people who are also on the journey. I feel like it's a really awesome way to connect. I personally learn so much. I've been in a few different artist communities, like on Discord especially, and I learned so much just by like watching other people talk, just by listening in on their conversations. Maddie inspired you to get into gouache. Yes, Maddie is an amazing artist. Maddie does streams on Behance. Behance, right? Is that what it's called? Behance? Adobe makes it. Adobe Behance, I think it's called. And there are so many amazing artists. Like, I barely touched the tip of the iceberg, but I just wanted to show some of my few favorites who really inspire me to like think outside the box when it comes to gouache painting. And yeah. Oh, so I skipped over finishing. I skipped right over it because I was too excited. So basically, there are a few different ways to finish your gouache paintings. And by finish, I mean you're done painting, you want to sell it. How do you make that painting ready to sell? You can either frame it behind glass, and that will protect it. You probably want to get UV glass, or the kind that filters out UV, because it'll just help your colors last longer. And just, I mean, you probably know this already, but when you're framing artwork on paper, never let the painting touch the glass. You always want to have a tiny amount of space in there. Usually that is achieved by adding a mat to it, so that separates the painting from the glass a little bit, because if there's no separation, mold happens pretty much. Depending on your environment, like any amount of moisture, it'll promote mold, so be careful. But typically you won't have to worry, because if you have a frame, if you bought a nice frame, it's going to have a mat in it and it's going to separate enough. But if you don't want to frame it behind glass, there are options out there. Or if you want to seal your painting for whatever reason, I've been using this Dorland's wax medium, and I have a whole video about it if you want to go watch that. Yeah, it's just easier. Go watch that video. And I love this stuff. I've actually sealed all of my finished gouache sketchbooks now. So if I dump water on my gouache sketchbook, I don't have to worry anymore. I used to be so paranoid. Like, really, I have accidentally splashed paintings before. And as I mentioned earlier, if you accidentally splash gouache, even if it's even if it's dry, that water is going to start sinking down into the pigment. It's going to start moving the pigment around. And if you, heaven forbid, think, oh no, I splashed water on there. Oh no. Oh no. Like, the second you start wiping it off, all that pigment's coming up. And if you let it dry completely without picking it up, you're probably going to end up with a little, like a little water spot like that. And it's just awful. So sealing your gouache, if there's any chance that it can be splashed, or I don't know, it's peace of mind. I use the wax medium. There's a bunch of different brands you can find out there, but I love this one. And you actually can seal your paintings with regular varnish. You probably want to research like a particular varnish that works for your surface. So like if you have any of the paper showing through, you want to make sure you're using a varnish that doesn't yellow, or I just want to make sure you guys do your research, because I can't recommend. I've never sealed my gouache with regular varnish. I think Lena Revo has a tutorial on that if you're interested. Maybe there's some other tutorials out there. But it's something to think about. Like every sealer out there, every varnish out there is going to have its own rules, its own. You just want to do your research. Just let's leave it there. Can you spray workable fixative? I have used workable fixative before. I found that maybe it depends on the brand, maybe it depends on how you use it, how much you use. It shifted my colors a lot and it made them feel kind of dull. So I stopped using it. I never went back to it. So again, something that you might want to research, or you might want to compare a few different brands. Maybe do some test sheets and like try to just kind of see. I don't know. I keep saying just do your research, because that's part of it. Being a self-reliant artist requires research. And plus, like, I would never believe anybody. You don't believe me, you guys. Take take what I'm saying and then go do your own research, go do your own tests. But that's the thing, like I hear, or I read a lot about how to do things online, but I don't fully believe them until I try myself, because the way I do something might be the way different than the way they did it, and that's going to lead to a different result. So it's never going to be as just straightforward as just like getting all your advice online. Oh my goodness, Nakiska, thank you so much for that. I think that's my first super chat. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I think we are now moving on to the question part of stream. Oh, that was my alert. Oh my god, you're the first person to activate that alert. That's funny. I forgot about it. Do you use wax on watercolor paintings to finish? No, I don't seal my watercolor paintings. I frame them. So, yeah. I mean, it should be fine, because like I've used this on many different gouache paintings, many different papers. It works on everything. So I think I have a couple videos with this, and one of them is on my sketchbook and one of them is on a wooden board that I painted on. So like, yeah, it works on a few different things. Okay, so yeah, questions. Anybody have any questions? Anybody have anything you want me to demonstrate, go into a little bit more? Dealing with the color shift in gouache. Most annoying part. Yeah. So my recommendation is to always mix enough of one color that you need, because trying to match that color shift is what trying to match wow, I can't English. The color shift is what makes it difficult to match mixes. So if I try to go back and match one of these mixes, like just by mixing it myself, putting it next to it, it's gonna be so hard, because it's gonna dry a little lighter or dry a little darker. And having your colors mixed on your palette, like pre-mix a few colors, will help. Then what I usually do is a test mark. So if I'm painting fast, or if I'm painting with colors I know very well, which the more you paint with your colors, the more you get used to them. I'll do a test, just a quick sweep, either on top of another color or next to another color, and I'll wait and I'll see how that dries, and then do another mark and see how that dries. And the more you do it, the less you have to do it. Does that make sense? You get used to it. So by now, because I've been using the same primaries for so long, for so many different paintings, I know how they're going to look when they dry. It doesn't take as much, I don't have to guess as much. And I don't have to do as many test brush strokes as I used to. But the thing is, like, color is relative, right? So if you're painting on top of this red, it's going to make the red look different. It's going to make the color you're using look different. So you might want to just do a test brushstroke anyway to make sure that they kind of play nicely together, and then decide if you want to adjust it. What do you do with yourself or your time while waiting for something to dry? You just like sitting there waiting for it to continue. This is your best friend. This is a heat gun, a heat tool. You can use a blow dryer, a hair dryer. This is a heat tool made for crafts. And oh my God, why are we listening to Christmas music? Oh God. No. Sorry, I almost had a panic attack. Okay. Heat tools are amazing and they dry so fast. Gouache already dries really fast, so it usually only takes like a minute to dry a layer. So highly recommend one of these. Otherwise, if I'm not using a heat gun, I will wait for something to dry over here and work on a different part of the painting, or work on two paintings at one time. I do that a lot, actually. Have you found a difference in painting since you changed your palette? Once you put your paints into the palette box that seals. Since you put your paints into the palette box. Okay. Yeah, so where is it? I still paint on here all the time. Like half the time I paint with this, half the time I paint with this. But I do paint more often because of this. So especially in the warmer months, this is my best friend. I keep this in my backpack. Yeah, like most days it's just in my backpack ready to go. So I can just, if it's suddenly sunny out, I will grab my backpack and just go outside and paint. And this makes it so much easier. Otherwise, I'm like juggling all my tubes around and like trying to remember where I put which color. And it's just, I don't know, just not conducive to my spontaneous ways of painting. So I keep my tubes on my desk or near my desk, and I keep this on or near my desk. And that's what I'll use in the studio more often. And then this is my travel, my go. I keep it in my go bag. So yeah, overall I paint more often because of it. Used Dorlands in your gouache experiments since 2019. I love it. Awesome. Good to know. Have you ever painted iridescence or have any idea of how to approach painting it? Well, so I'm assuming you mean you don't mean using iridescent paint, right? You're saying painting an object that's iridescent? That's interesting. I mean, they make iridescent paint, so you could use that. Otherwise, I would probably go with like a dry brush technique. So, you know, anytime I want to add a bit of glimmer, as I call it, maybe. Okay, so like making the sparkle on the water, dry brush. Making the final little glimmer or highlights on the water, dry brush. Wispy clouds, dry brush. Rough sand or soft sand, dry brush. Like, it's so good for so many things. I don't think I have anything. Oh god, just throw that anywhere. Moving water, dry brush. Get the picture? But dry brush won't stand out in your painting unless it's on or next to a soft or a smooth layer. So you have to use both. You have to have that versatility. Otherwise they kind of just it'll just be all dry brush and it'll look really crazy. Basically just test and paint more often. I know it's probably not the answer you're looking for. Your first set is the jelly. Any comments on starting with those? Go for it. I mean, the thing is, I would never use those, but I have heard that a lot of people start with the jelly Himi gouache or whatever brand it is, and it encourages them to start with gouache first of all, which is awesome, and it encourages them to paint more often because it's just there, ready to go. It's literally the same as this. It is this, but I think their palette cups are bigger. So this is so convenient. I prefer this because it's completely 100% airtight and it's smaller amounts, so I can change them if I want. I can replenish them as I go. It just means my paint is fresher more often. But it's the same concept. It, like I said, it encourages me to paint more often. So totally love anything that encourages that. I can't really speak to the quality of it because I've never used them. So, you know, but if it's your first set, I feel like quality of the gouache, like it's good enough to get you started. It's enough to get you started learning about how gouache kind of moves and flows and how much water you need, or gets you started with that water control practice. So yeah, go for it. Do you find it more pleasurable to paint with the moist paints or the dried pans? Oh, Arcuda, there must be a miscommunication because I never use re-wetted gouache. Re-wetted gouache to me is pointless. Sorry, just my opinion. I re-wetted gouache, I think I mentioned this at the very beginning, but okay, so in order to re-wet gouache, like if it's dried, this is liquid, by the way. This is all liquid. If the gouache is dry and you want to re-wet it, you have to use water. The second you add water, it starts diluting it. The second you start diluting it, it's not as opaque. To me, the whole point of using gouache is because it's opaque. So I don't want to use it. The only time I use it watered down is in like my first layer to get the background laid in, or just to get like an undercolor laid in. Yeah, I never use dried gouache. I hate dried gouache. So tube paint 100% of the time. I either pour it straight on my palette and paint from there, or pour it in here, and this is liquid. It's sealed airtight, so it never dries out. To me, painting with re-wetted gouache is watercolor. Like, that's basically the same as watercolor, except you have a different binder. The thing is, there's also, like with gouache, because the pigment load is so much, there's more pigments, there's more pigment particles in the paint. Well, there should be anyway, if it's high quality. That means that the binder is different, first of all, and if you water it down too much, the pigment might separate from the binder, and you can get like this dusty feeling or dustiness on your gouache, on your painting. I've never experienced it to the point where it's made a difference, because my diluted gouache is always in the underlayer and I paint over it anyway. But if you are experiencing that, if you've ever had like weird texture on your gouache, or just some kind of weird dustiness happening, it might be because your gouache is either not good quality or that it's too watered down. Something weird could be happening, like the pigment separating from the binder. I feel like that would be really rare though. Like, I don't know why you would use it like that and not paint up thicker on top of it. You meant painting an object rather than using iridescent paint. Okay, yeah. You're painting an iridescent snake. Oh man, I would be using like a nice smooth gradient on as the base, and then coming back with like a really interesting dry brush color on top of it. Maybe even like purple something. I don't know. Yeah, have fun with dry brush. You can revive old gouache if you grind it and add a few drops of water. Yeah, you can do that. You can do that with watercolor, with gouache. You can bring it back to life. I've done it with my watercolor a few times, but so I have like all the supplies to make my own watercolors. I don't do it very often, but because of that, if I ever if one of my tubes completely dried out and I was desperate, I would just open up the tube, crumble out all the particles, grind it, mix it, add a little more binder, and then I'd be good to go. Can you gesso over gouache to reuse paper? I don't see why not, but you might have some weird, like, I don't see how it could be a problem, because I assume the gesso creates like creates a solid barrier. But as long as the gouache is completely 100% dry, I don't see it causing any issues. But instead of doing that, I'd say just buy some cheap paper. Like I was mentioning earlier, this is actually what I use. So this is a sheet of Dollar Rowney A4 hot press watercolor paper, not cotton. It's like, 3 pennies per page. I don't know. It's so cheap. It comes in a huge, a huge pad, and you just tear off each piece. I can't English. Each piece of paper. Why is that a tongue twister? You just tear off the paper, and I usually cut them down in half or cut them down into fours. Yeah, super, super cheap, fresh sheet of paper each time. And the thing is, like, okay, actually I should mention, painting with gouache on a non-porous surface is really annoying. I actually have tried. I used acrylic gouache and let it completely dry, and then painted with regular gouache on top of it, and it kind of beads up in some areas. Basically, it seems like gouache wants some kind of porous surface to sink into, to grab onto. So if you're gonna seal your surface and then paint on top of it, or if you're painting on some kind of weird object, just know that gouache might not like it. You might have to do some tests. I've had some weird situations like that. Can you use gouache over colored pencils in mixed media? I've tried a little bit of stuff of like mixed media with acrylic, pen, colored pencil, gouache, things like that. If the colored pencil is a waxy layer, gouache will not stick to it. Gouache will hate it. It's almost like a resist. It's like if you used fixative for watercolor, the negative painting technique. So yeah, I don't know how well it will work. You might have to do some tests. Watercolor ground work for gouache? Yeah, I've seen it plenty of times. Actually, I bought some watercolor ground specifically for that purpose. I don't know where the jar is. Because I was gonna paint on some wood, and I wanted to have like a nice surface to work on. So yeah, I think it would work for almost any wet paint medium, water medium. Casein, tempera, I'm not so sure about. Do you use zinc white to create lighter colors or titanium white? Most of the time when I'm mixing in my painting, I will use zinc white. Let's see if I have an example. Okay, so zinc white mixed into that painting. All you see there is zinc white. Titanium white. I hate this painting, by the way, but I'm showing you anyway. Mixed mostly on top. The white is kind of saved for the final layer. Do you see a difference? If you don't see a difference, that's fine, because I can barely see a difference. But basically, I use zinc white when I'm mixing into my colors, and I use permanent white when I'm doing the final highlights. That's just my preference. How is gouache different from tempera? Poster paints. Different binder. That's all that separates paint. Pigment is the same in all paint, basically. They might be ground slightly different, or some pigment particles might be slightly bigger, which I believe they are in gouache, but binder is basically the difference between all paint. And because of that, sometimes the finish will look different. So, for instance, oil paint, it's because oil is in the binder. Oil is holding it together. It has a completely different look and feel than gouache. Although I will say that blending with gouache feels very similar to oil paint, which I love, but it dries so fast, which I love. Like, it's the best of both worlds. But yeah, I've never used tempera. I've never used poster paint. I've heard of it. I've seen it plenty. It looks interesting. It looks like I just don't have a reason, I guess. Like, I was kind of interested in poster paint for a while because I was seeing it in a jar. Like, they came in these jars, and I kind of liked the idea of that, but I was like, I don't know. Like, I already use so many different things. I just don't have a reason. And I currently am obsessed with gouache and oil, and I already don't have enough time for all the things I want to do. Okay, so let me... Oh, I think one last thing we were talking about light fastness of colors and like how to finish your artwork, obviously with frames and stuff is pretty standard, but along those lines, just advise your buyers to never hang art in direct sunlight. That will also help the colors last longer. If you're using light fast colors in the first place, it won't be as big of a deal, but light UV will break down everything eventually. I think I covered everything else that I wanted to cover. And I know I talked fast and I went over a ton of stuff that it all feels like a blur in my head right now, but does anyone have any other questions or want me to demonstrate anything before we end? By the way, I already put a bunch of stuff in the links in the description below, so I think I put links to my classes, obviously, my supplies. I think I wrote down the names of a few of the artists I talked about earlier. If I think of anything else, I'll try to add it after the stream. But otherwise, like, if you guys ask questions in the comments, I will answer as much as I can. More specific about the dollar brownie paper. Oh, do I have it? I don't know if I still have the outer casing. I do! It's your lucky day! Oh god, I just dropped a bunch of papers. This is what I use. 100% cellulose, which obviously that is pretty common paper, but it's not the fancy 100% cotton stuff that I would use for watercolor, because with watercolor, paper makes a bigger difference. This, I mean, yeah. But with any kind of paper, any kind of painting, if you're paper surface, just make sure it's acid free. Whether it's cotton or not is just a preference thing, and it's like a performance thing, which makes a difference. With watercolor, I will point that out. But with gouache, because I tend to paint thicker and I just like build up my layers on top of it, I don't care if it has cotton. It doesn't make a difference. What's a ruling pen? I can't think of that, like what that is on the top of my head. Yeah, so if you're here in the future watching the replay, since you weren't here to ask questions, feel free to comment with your question, and myself, or I'm sure other people, will be happy to chime in. Otherwise, if you guys don't have any other questions, I guess we will end it here. And also, just as a reminder for everyone, I guess, I stream on Mondays over on Twitch, and it's pretty regular now. I'm trying to do more streams here, but I also stream on my Patreon and do like specific requests over on my Patreon. So I'm kind of streaming everywhere now, and I love it. But tomorrow is the next Patreon stream. If you are a Patreon and didn't know that I do that, just make sure you check my page once in a while, because I announce it before I go live. Thank you guys so much. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. the small palette box. Well, like I said, it doesn't matter what brand it is. Watercolor palette box. Make sure it has a silicone seal inside. It has a airtight lid. Yeah, that's basically all you need. Are these comments saved? I want to go back and read others. Yeah, the live chat it'll be live replay. So if you go watch my stream, watch this stream in the future, either on the side or below it, there will be a live chat replay. And there is a little drop down, I think, that says either top chat or all messages or something like that. Just like double check that it's showing all messages. But yeah. So yeah, no, I haven't used one of those pencils, I guess. Yeah. Thank you guys. Okay. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave it here. And I'll add more information to the description if I can think of anything else. But otherwise, I will see you in Discord and maybe tomorrow on Patreon stream or Monday on Twitch. And if you didn't notice, I did post a new video today about painting on toned paper with gouache. So you can go watch that if you haven't already. And if you want to help me out, just press the thumbs up on my videos. For some reason, YouTube prioritizes thumbs up these days. It's just a thing. So thank you guys. I hope you have an amazing weekend. Oh my gosh, winter's rain. Thank you. I really appreciate that super chat. How long did you need to control gouache? Okay, so the final question. Thank you, winter's rain. How long did it take me to control gouache? I would say I got kind of confident with it within a few months, but I was using it every single day. So yeah. But I will also say that years later, I am still learning something almost every time I paint and constantly leveling up. So it never ends. And I can look back at those first gouache paintings and I'm like, ugh, go away. So yeah, I don't know if that helps, but anyways, okay, time to end. I'm gonna put my end screen on, and if you have any other questions, leave a comment. There we go. Oh my gosh, trying to click the wrong thing. Anyways, leave a comment and I will talk to you all soon. Have an amazing weekend. Stay inspired. Bye bye.